When a narcissist loses an empath, something very profound begins to happen beneath the surface. Something that isn't immediately visible in the dramatic reactions, the anger, the blame, or even the indifference they may perform. What begins to collapse is not just the relationship. It is the structure of the false self they have spent a lifetime building. You see, narcissism is not confidence. It is not strength. It is not superiority. It is a survival strategy. It is a carefully engineered identity formed in response to deep emotional wounding. Somewhere early in life, authenticity did not feel safe. Vulnerability did not feel welcome. Needs were not met in a way that allowed a child to feel inherently worthy, and so the psyche adapts. It creates a version of the self that appears powerful, admired, in control. This version becomes armor, but armor is heavy, and it must constantly be reinforced. That's where the empath enters. The empath, often unconsciously, becomes the mirror that reflects back admiration, validation, emotional energy, and reassurance. The empath senses the pain beneath the surface, even if they can't name it. They see potential. They see woundedness. They offer patience, understanding, and forgiveness far beyond what is healthy. In doing so, they help stabilize the narcissist's fragile constructed identity. Spiritually speaking, the empath becomes a kind of external regulator. They soothe the narcissist's unprocessed shame. They absorb emotional volatility. They provide reassurance when insecurity flares. The narcissist may not consciously think, I need this person to hold up my identity, but psychologically and spiritually, that is exactly what is happening. Now imagine what occurs when that empath steps away. When the empath chooses boundaries, when they stop reflecting admiration, when they withdraw their emotional availability, when they no longer participate in the illusion. The mirror disappears. And without the mirror, the false self begins to crack. This is why the reaction can be so intense. It is not just about losing a partner. It is about losing the stabilizing structure that kept the deeper emptiness hidden. Beneath the grandiosity, beneath the entitlement, beneath the control, there is often a profound sense of deficiency, a belief formed long ago that I am not enough as I am. The empath temporarily silenced that belief. When they leave, the silence is broken. Suddenly, there is space, and space can be terrifying for someone who has built their entire identity around avoiding inner pain. The distractions are no longer working in the same way. The external validation is gone, or at least diminished. The carefully curated image feels less convincing without someone intimately reinforcing it. Spiritually, this can feel like falling. The narcissist may respond with rage. They may attempt to devalue the empath, rewriting the story so that they were never important. They may rush to replace them, seeking a new source of validation. They may appear unaffected, but internally there is often destabilization, because when the false self collapses, even partially, what it reveals is the original wound. And here is the tragedy. The collapse itself is not the problem. In fact, it is the beginning of potential healing. The problem is that most people will do almost anything to avoid feeling the grief that lives underneath their defenses. To truly face the collapse would mean acknowledging vulnerability. It would mean admitting dependency. It would mean feeling the shame and abandonment that were never processed in childhood. That is not easy work. It requires immense courage and self-awareness. So instead, many double down. They reinforce the armor. They blame the empath. They tell themselves a story in which they are the victim or the superior one. They seek new admiration to patch the cracks, and temporarily it works. The structure stands again. But it is weaker. Because somewhere in the psyche, there is now evidence that the identity is fragile, that it can be destabilized, that it depends on others more than they would ever like to admit. The empath's departure becomes a spiritual rupture. And rupture, in psychology, is always an opportunity. It is painful. Yes, it is destabilizing. But rupture can lead to integration if one is willing to stay with the discomfort. When the false self collapses, the authentic self is not destroyed. It is waiting. It has always been there, buried beneath adaptation, the child who needed love, the human being who longs for connection, not based on performance, but on presence, the self that does not need admiration to feel real, But accessing that self requires surrender. It requires stepping out of superiority and into humility, out of control and into vulnerability, out of image and into truth. And that is why losing an empath can be such a spiritually catalytic event. The empath was not just a partner. They were a regulator, a validator, a mirror. When that mirror disappears, there is a choice: construct a new illusion or meet the self that was hidden behind it. For the empath, walking away often feels like loss. For the narcissist, it feels like collapse. But collapse is not punishment. Collapse is revelation. The false self was never sustainable. It required too much maintenance, too much external reinforcement, too much avoidance of pain. When it cracks, what emerges is not weakness. It is the possibility of authenticity. But authenticity cannot be forced by another person. The empath cannot heal the narcissist by loving them harder. No amount of patience can substitute for self-confrontation. No amount of compassion can replace accountability. Healing begins when the individual says, "The problem is not what I lost. The problem is what I built to survive." Until that moment, the cycle continues. So what happens spiritually when a narcissist loses an empath? The illusion trembles. The mask slips. The structure destabilizes, and for a brief, powerful moment, truth becomes visible. Whether that truth becomes transformation or simply another layer of defense depends on the willingness to face the wound beneath the armor. Because when the false self collapses, the soul is finally given a chance to speak. When a narcissist loses an empath, what disappears is not simply companionship. What disappears is emotional supply. And to understand the spiritual impact of that loss, we have to understand what supply really means beneath the surface. Supply is not love. It is regulation. Many people assume narcissists seek admiration because they are arrogant. But what if admiration functions more like oxygen? What if validation is not about superiority, but about stabilizing a deeply fragile nervous system? When someone grows up without consistent emotional attunement, without being seen and valued for who they truly are, they do not develop a stable internal sense of worth. Instead, they learn to borrow it from the outside world. The empath becomes a primary source of that borrowed worth. Empaths are naturally attuned. They sense emotional shifts. They offer reassurance. They give the benefit of the doubt. They interpret coldness as pain. They respond to anger with patience. They try harder when things feel distant. And without realizing it, they become an external emotional regulator for the narcissist. Very time the narcissist feels insecure, the empath soothes. Every time shame rises, the empath reassures. Every time fear of abandonment surfaces, the empath proves loyalty. This dynamic can feel intense, even passionate. But spiritually, it is imbalanced. One person is sourcing stability internally, while the other is sourcing it externally. Now imagine what happens when that external regulator steps away. The narcissist may appear angry or dismissive. They may quickly seek someone new. But internally, there is often agitation, restlessness, irritability, a sense of being ungrounded, because the energetic exchange they relied on has stopped. The empath's presence functioned like a buffer between the narcissist and their own unresolved pain. Without that buffer, emotions they have avoided for years begin to rise to the surface. Shame, emptiness, fear, insecurity, loneliness. These are not new emotions, they are old ones. But they were previously numbed through admiration, control, attention, and relational dominance. When supply disappears, numbness fades. Spiritually speaking, this is experienced as starvation, not because the narcissist cannot survive alone, but because they have not learned how to generate internal worth. Their identity has been externally fed. The empath's validation became part of the psychological diet. And here is the part that is difficult to understand. The narcissist may not consciously know this is happening. They may simply feel wronged, abandoned, betrayed. They may focus on how unfair it is that the empath left, but beneath those surface narratives is dysregulation, a nervous system that does not know how to self-soothe. This is why some narcissists move quickly into new relationships. It is not always about romance. It is about stabilization. A new admirer restores equilibrium. A new source of attention quiets the inner chaos. The discomfort of introspection is postponed. But the loss of an empath is different from the loss of casual admiration. The empath offered depth. They offered emotional labor. They offered loyalty even during conflict. They absorbed projections. They tolerated mood swings. They tried to understand rather than retaliate. That kind of supply is rare. So when it vanishes, there is often a deeper destabilization than the narcissist anticipated. The replacement may provide admiration, but not the same depth of emotional cushioning. And without that cushioning, cracks widen. Spiritually, this is an invitation. When external supply is removed, the psyche has two options. It can scramble to replace it, or it can turn inward. Turning inward means feeling what has been avoided. It means asking uncomfortable questions. Why do I need constant validation? Why does criticism feel annihilating? Why does abandonment trigger rage instead of grief? These questions threaten the constructed identity, but they are also the doorway to healing. Because the real issue is not the loss of the empath. The real issue is the dependency on external regulation. True spiritual maturity requires developing an internal anchor, a sense of worth that does not fluctuate with praise or rejection, a nervous system that can tolerate discomfort without outsourcing it to someone else. The empath, in many ways, was compensating for that undeveloped internal anchor. And here is where compassion becomes important. Not enabling, not excusing harmful behavior, but understanding that beneath narcissistic patterns there is often profound developmental trauma. A child who learned that love was conditional. A child who learned that being impressive was safer than being authentic. A child who learned that vulnerability led to humiliation or neglect. The empath temporarily provided what was missing in childhood: ode, attunement. But adulthood healing cannot depend on another person playing that role indefinitely. So when the empath leaves, the spiritual lesson is this: no one else can regulate your worth for you. That lesson can feel brutal. Without supply, the narcissist may experience what feels like identity erosion. If I am not admired, who am I? If no one is validating me, what stabilizes me? If I cannot control how I am perceived, what protects me? These questions are terrifying when you have built your life around avoiding them. So often, instead of sitting with the fear, the narcissist externalizes it. They blame, they criticize, they seek revenge, they rewrite history. Anything to avoid sitting alone with the emptiness. But emptiness is not the enemy. Emptiness is unprocessed grief. Grief for the authenticity that was sacrificed. Grief for the authenticity that was sacrificed. Grief for the self that never felt inherently enough. The empath's absence removes distraction, and in that quiet, grief becomes audible. Whether that grief is acknowledged determines everything. If it is suppressed, the cycle continues. New supply, temporary stabilization, repeated collapse. But if it is acknowledged, if the narcissist dares to feel instead of perform, then something extraordinary can happen. Dependence begins to transform into self-awareness. Validation begins to shift from external to internal. Control begins to soften into connection. That is spiritual growth. Not perfection, not sainthood, but the gradual movement from unconscious survival to conscious presence. The empath did not cause the instability. They revealed it. And sometimes the greatest act of love, though it may not feel like love, is walking away so that the other person is forced to face themselves. Supply can soothe, but it cannot heal. Admiration can inflate, but it cannot integrate. Only self-confrontation can do that. So when a narcissist loses an empath, they lose more than a partner. They lose the emotional scaffolding that held their fragile identity upright, and in that loss lies a choice. Chase another source of fuel, or learn to become your own source of steadiness. Because until you can sit alone without collapsing, you will always confuse attention with love. When the empath leaves, something very uncomfortable happens. The noise quiets. And for someone who has spent a lifetime avoiding their own inner world, silence can feel unbearable. As long as the empath was present, there was movement, conversation, conflict, reassurance, admiration, tension, reconciliation. There was stimulation. There was emotional exchange. Even the drama served a purpose. It distracted from something deeper. It kept the nervous system externally engaged. But when the empath steps away, the external engagement drops. The arguments stop. The emotional caretaking stops. And what remains is stillness. Now, stillness for a regulated nervous system can feel peaceful. But for a dysregulated one, stillness amplifies everything that has been buried. This is the forced confrontation with inner wounds. You see, narcissistic patterns are not random. They are adaptive. At some point in early life, vulnerability was not safe. Perhaps emotional needs were dismissed. Perhaps love was conditional. Perhaps there was criticism, neglect, unpredictability, or even humiliation. A child in that environment does not have the option of leaving, so they adapt. They create a self that can survive. That self may become hyperachieving. It may become charming. It may become superior. It may become emotionally detached. But underneath, the original wound remains untouched. It is simply covered. The empath's presence allowed that covering to stay intact. Because the empath, arbid projections. They soothed insecurities. They tolerated emotional distance. They worked to repair ruptures. In many ways, they buffered the narcissist from ever having to fully feel the depth of their unresolved pain. When that buffer disappears, the wound is exposed. This is the spiritual crossroads. Without distraction, old feelings begin to surface. Shame that was never processed. Fear of abandonment that predates the relationship. A sense of inadequacy that was formed in childhood, but masked by adult performance. These emotions can feel overwhelming, because they are not new, they are cumulative. And here is where the psyche faces a choice. One path is expansion of defense. Blame the empath, devalue them, rewrite the narrative so that their departure proves their weakness, not your wound. Seek new supply immediately. Stay busy. Stay distracted. Stay externally focused. The other path is far more difficult. It is the path of sitting in discomfort without immediately escaping it. That means allowing the feeling of abandonment to be felt, not acted out through rage, but felt in the body. It means noticing the tightness in the chest, the agitation in the stomach, the restlessness in the mind, and asking gently, when have I felt this before? Very often, if one is courageous enough to ask that question honestly, the answer does not point to the empath. It points much further back. It points to a childhood bedroom, a schoolyard humiliation, a parent who was emotionally unavailable, a moment of being unseen. The empath did not create the wound. They activated it, and when they leave, the activation becomes undeniable. This is why the loss can feel disproportionate. It is not just about losing a partner. It is about re-experiencing unresolved attachment pain. Now, from the outside, observers may say, why doesn't the narcissist just admit their pain? But Scion requires safety. And for someone who learned early that vulnerability equals danger, feeling that pain can feel life-threatening. So the nervous system mobilizes. Anger is easier than grief. Superiority is easier than shame. Blame is easier than self-reflection. But here's the truth. Until grief is felt, it is acted out. The empath often absorbed the acting out. When they leave, the narcissist is left alone with it. And alone is precisely where healing must begin. Spiritual growth is not about adopting new beliefs. It is about integrating disowned parts of the self. The abandoned child, the humiliated teenager, the insecure young adult. These parts do not disappear just because we construct a powerful persona. They wait. Loss is what calls them forward. And this is why losing an empath can be such a catalytic event. Because for perhaps the first time in a long time, the narcissist cannot immediately outsource their emotional discomfort. The usual dynamic is gone. The familiar pattern is interrupted. Interruption creates awareness, if one is willing to tolerate it. If, instead of reaching for distraction, the individual turns inward and asks, what is this pain trying to show me? Something extraordinary can happen. The anger begins to soften into sadness. The blame begins to dissolve into insight. The superiority begins to reveal insecurity. This is not weakness, It is integration. But integration requires responsibility, not self-condemnation. Responsibility. Responsibility means recognizing that while early wounds were not your fault, healing them is your work. It means acknowledging that control and manipulation were strategies, not identities. It means understanding that pushing people away before they can abandon you is not strength. It is protection. The empath's departure removes the illusion that the strategy is working. Because if the strategy truly worked, connection would remain stable. Instead, the pattern repeats: intensity, idealization, conflict, rupture, loss. At some point, the repetition itself becomes evidence. And so the question becomes, will the pain of introspection be tolerated, or will the pain be projected outward again? This is the crossroads. Spiritual maturity begins when we stop asking, who hurt me, and begin asking, what part of me is still hurting? The empath cannot answer that question for the narcissist. No amount of patience or compassion can force self-awareness, but their absence creates the space in which self-awareness becomes possible. And sometimes that space feels like falling into grief, falling into vulnerability, falling into the realization that the self you've been protecting is not the self you truly are. But falling is not destruction. Falling is descent, and descent is how we reach what was buried. If that descent is embraced, even slowly, even imperfectly, it becomes transformation. The defensive self loosens. Relationships shift from performance to presence. But if the descent is resisted, the defenses grow stronger. The next relationship becomes another arena for avoiding the same wound. So what happens spiritually when the empath leaves? The distraction ends, the wound surfaces, and the psyche is invited, perhaps for the first time in years, to feel what it has spent a lifetime outrunning. Whether that invitation is accepted determines everything, because the pain you refuse to face will always choose your relationships for you. When the empath walks away, something else begins to unravel, and this piece is often misunderstood. It is not just the loss of admiration, not just the surfacing of old wounds. It is the shattering of control. Control, for many people with narcissistic adaptations, is not about demeanor. Tation for pleasure. It is about safety. If I can control how you see me, I can control whether you reject me. If I can control the emotional temperature of the relationship, I can prevent abandonment. If I can control the narrative, I never have to feel powerless again. Powerlessness is the original injury. Somewhere early in life there was an experience of helplessness, a child who could not influence a parent's mood, a child who could not secure consistent affection, a child who felt small in the face of unpredictable authority. That helplessness leaves an imprint on the nervous system, and later in life, control becomes the antidote. So when we speak about narcissistic control in relationships, subtle manipulation, emotional withdrawal, gaslighting, blame shifting, we are often witnessing a frightened nervous system, attempting to avoid reliving old helplessness. The empath by nature tends to accommodate. They smooth things over. They take responsibility for harmony. They over-explain. They try to understand. In doing so, unintentionally, they participate in a dynamic where control is rarely directly challenged. But when the empath chooses boundaries, something radical happens. They stop negotiating their reality. They stop chasing reassurance. They stop over-functioning. They stop accepting distortions. And in that moment, control slips. For someone who relies on control as a psychological stabilizer, this feels destabilizing at the core. It can trigger anger, panic, or desperate attempts to regain dominance. Hoovering, sudden declarations of love, promises of change, or alternatively, harsh devaluation. These are not random reactions. They are attempts to restore equilibrium, because without control, the old helplessness threatens to return. Spiritually speaking, control is an illusion of invulnerability. It creates the sense that I am not at the mercy of anyone. But intimacy, true intimacy, requires surrender. It requires mutual influence. It requires accepting that you cannot fully dictate another person's thoughts, feelings, or choices. That is terrifying for someone who equates loss of control with emotional annihilation. When the empath leaves, they are not simply exiting a relationship. They are withdrawing participation in a system of control. And that withdrawal exposes how dependent the narcissistic structure was on managing external reality. Now there is no one to dominate emotionally, no one to intimidate subtly, no one to reshape through persuasion, no one to stabilize through strategic affection or withdrawal. The system collapses because it cannot function unilaterally. And what emerges in that collapse is vulnerability. But vulnerability here does not initially feel soft. It feels raw. It feels like panic beneath the anger. It feels like restlessness beneath the arrogance. It feels like the ground has shifted. Many people will misinterpret this reaction as pure ego. And yes, ego is involved. But beneath ego is fear. Fear of insignificance. Fear of abandonment. Fear of not mattering. Control was the strategy that kept those fears at bay. When control is shattered, there is an opportunity, not a guarantee, but an opportunity, to see the strategy for what it is. You begin to recognize that manipulating outcomes has not produced genuine security, that dominating conversations has not created intimacy, that being right has not created connection, that winning has not created peace. The empath's departure reveals a simple but profound truth. You can control someone and still lose them. And that realization can be devastating, because if control cannot guarantee safety, then what can? This is where spiritual maturity begins to whisper. Not in grand declarations, but in quiet realizations. Safety does not me from control. It comes from self-regulation. It comes from tolerating uncertainty. It comes from allowing others to have autonomy without interpreting it as threat. But to access that understanding, the old belief must crack. The belief that vulnerability equals danger. Control was designed to prevent vulnerability, but it also prevented authentic connection. The empath may have stayed longer than was healthy, but eventually even the most patient nervous system reaches its limit. And when they leave, they demonstrate something powerful. Love without self-abandonment is not negotiable. For the narcissist, this can feel like betrayal. But in truth, it is exposure. Exposure of the fact that control was never true power. Real power is the ability to sit with discomfort without forcing someone else to carry it. Real power is tolerating disagreement without retaliating. Real power is admitting fear instead of disguising it as superiority. But those capacities require internal stability that was never developed. So the loss of control becomes the gateway to developing it. If the individual is willing to reflect instead of react, they may begin to ask different questions. Not, how do I get them back, but why did I need to control in the first place? Not, how do I prove I'm right, but what am I afraid would happen if I wasn't? These questions soften the defensive structure. They shift the focus from external management to internal awareness. And awareness is transformative. Because when you realize that control was protecting a younger, wounded part of you, compassion becomes possible, not self-pity. Compassion. You begin to see that the part of you that demanded obedience was actually terrified of being left. The part that dismissed your partner's feelings was afraid of being overwhelmed by your own. The part that needed to win every argument was protecting. Against feeling small. When that recognition happens, control no longer feels empowering. It feels exhausting. The empath's departure, painful as it may be, removes the illusion that control can secure love. It forces the confrontation with a deeper truth. Connection cannot be commanded. It must be co-created. And co-creation requires humility. Humility is not humiliation. It is the willingness to acknowledge that you are not omnipotent, that others have agency, that your fear does not entitle you to override someone else's autonomy. For someone who has equated control with survival, this shift feels enormous. But it is also liberating, because maintaining control requires constant vigilance, constant monitoring, constant manipulation of perception. Letting go of control allows for something unfamiliar but profoundly healing. Mutuality begins with relinquishing dominance. So when a narcissist loses an empath, the shattering of control is not merely relational, it is existential. The strategy that once guaranteed emotional safety is revealed to be insufficient, and in that revelation lies a choice. Cling tighter to control in the next relationship, or learn to build safety within, so control is no longer necessary. Because the truth is this: the more you try to control love, the more you guarantee its absence. When the empath finally walks away, there is another shift that is subtle but profoundly spiritual. It is what I would call the energetic reversal. In the dynamic between a narcissist and an empath, there is often an invisible exchange happening beneath the visible behaviors. The empath absorbs. The narcissist projects. The empath carries. The narcissist discharges. The empath processes emotions, both theirs and the other person's. The narcissist, unable or unwilling to metabolize certain feelings, unconsciously transfers them outward. Projection is not cruelty at its core. It is a defense. When shame is too painful to feel, it is easier to see it in someone else. When insecurity feels intolerable, it is more comfortable to accuse another of weakness. When anger toward oneself is overwhelming, it can be redirected outward as criticism. The empath, because of their heightened sensitivity and compassion, often internalizes these projections. They ask themselves, maybe I am too sensitive. Maybe I am not supportive enough. Maybe I am the problem. They take in what does not belong to them and attempt to fix it within themselves. This dynamic can go on for years. But when the empath awakens, when they begin to see clearly, when they stop internalizing what was never theirs, the exchange changes. And when they leave, it stops entirely. That is the energetic reversal. All the emotions that were once discharged outward have nowhere to go. The shame that was projected has no container. The insecurity that was deflected is no longer absorbed. The blame that was redirected returns to its source, and this can feel overwhelming. Because the narcissistic adaptation often depends on not feeling certain emotions fully. It depends on externalizing discomfort. But when there is no longer a receptive empath willing to carry that emotional weight, the system becomes closed. What was projected returns. This is not mystical punishment. It is psychological reality. When you accuse someone else of what you cannot tolerate in yourself, and they no longer accept that accusation, you are left with the original feeling. If you call them selfish, and they refuse to defend themselves, you are left with your own unmet needs. If you call them inadequate and they no longer argue, you are left with your own self-doubt. If you label them unstable and they respond with calm detachment, you are left alone with your own turbulence. The empath's absence removes the outlet. And here is the deeper spiritual truth. What we refuse to integrate will always return. In relationships marked by projection, there is often a kind of emotional outsourcing. The empath becomes the container for chaos. They hold space, they absorb tension, they process conflict. The narcissist remains insulated from the full impact of their inner fragmentation. But once the empath withdraws, fragmentation becomes more difficult to ignore. This is why sometimes after losing an empath, the narcissist appears more volatile, more restless, or even more grandiose. The projections intensify temporarily because the psyche is scrambling to rid itself of discomfort. Without a familiar target, the energy has to go somewhere. It may be directed at coworkers, family members, new partners, or even strangers. But the relief is short-lived, because projection works only when someone receives it. When no one internalizes the accusation loses power. When no one reacts defensively, manipulation loses effectiveness. When no one absorbs the shame lingers. And that lingering is the beginning of reckoning. For perhaps the first time, the narcissist may feel emotions without immediate displacement. That experience can be disorienting. Imagine carrying a weight you've been handing off to someone else for years. Suddenly your arms are full. You feel the strain. The empath, during the relationship, often carried more than their share of emotional responsibility. They anticipated moods. They managed conflict. They self-corrected constantly. They tried to prevent escalation. In doing so, they prevented the narcissist from fully experiencing the consequences of their own emotional patterns. When they step away, that buffer dissolves. Consequences become clearer. Not in the sense of revenge, but in the sense of reality. If you repeatedly dismiss someone's feelings, eventually they leave. If you refuse accountability, trust erodes. If you project shame instead of processing it, intimacy deteriorates. The empath's departure is not the cause of the narcissist's discomfort. It is the removal of protection from it. Now, here is the opportunity within the reversal. If the narcissist begins to notice, I keep feeling anger long after the argument ends, or I feel restless even when no one is criticizing me, or I feel empty even when someone praises me, they may begin to ask deeper questions. Why do these feelings persist? Why do they not disappear when I blame someone else? Why does the same conflict keep repeating in different forms? These questions mark the beginning of integration. Integration means recognizing that what we see in others is often a reflection of what we struggle to accept in ourselves. It means acknowledging that projections are clues, not accusations. If I consistently accuse others of betrayal, perhaps I am disconnected from my own loyalty. If I accuse others of selfishness, perhaps I am estranged from my own unmet needs. The empath, by stepping out of the projection cycle, forces that reflection to occur. And reflection can feel merciless, but it is also clarifying. The energy that was once directed outward now has the potential to be redirected inward, not as self-attack, but as self-inquiry. Instead of asking, who made me feel this way? The question becomes, what part of me is activated? That shift changes everything. Because when emotional responsibility returns to its rightful owner, growth becomes possible. You can only heal what you acknowledge is yours. The empath's role was never to carry another person's unresolved shame indefinitely. Their departure restores balance. It says, this belongs to you. And while that may initially feel harsh, it is actually respectful. It assumes capacity. It assumes that the individual is capable of confronting their own inner world. Spiritually, the energetic reversal is a homecoming. All the displaced emotions come back to the psyche that generated them. The chaos that was once scattered externally gathers internally, and in that gathering, there is potential for coherence. But coherence requires courage. It requires sitting with discomfort without projecting it outward. It requires tolerating shame long enough to transform it into accountability. It requires feeling insecurity without converting it into superiority. Most people resist this stage. It feels like drowning at first. But if one stays present, something shifts. The emotions that felt overwhelming begin to soften. When they are owned, shame becomes regret. Regret becomes responsibility. Responsibility becomes growth. The empath's absence did not create the storm. It simply stopped absorbing it. And once the storm is no longer displaced, it must either be processed or it will repeat elsewhere. So what happens spiritually when the narcissist loses the empath? The energy that was projected outward returns home. The emotions that were avoided demand recognition. And the illusion that someone else can carry your inner world dissolves. Because in the end, what you refuse to face in yourself will always find its way back to you. When the empath leaves and the emotional supply disappears, when control has been shattered and projections have nowhere to land, something else begins to surface. It is what I would call the ego injury, an identity crisis that cuts much deeper than most people realize. You see, the narcissistic personality is not just a collection of behaviors. It is an identity constructed around being admired, needed, superior, special, or indispensable. That identity is fragile, even if it appears grand from the outside. It depends heavily on reflection, on how others respond, react, validate, and affirm. The empath played a unique role in maintaining that identity. Empaths do something very powerful. They see potential. They see the wounded child beneath the arrogance. They see the charisma beneath the insecurity. They see what the person could become if only they healed. And often, they communicate that belief, sometimes directly, sometimes through loyalty and patience. That belief becomes intoxicating. To be seen as extraordinary, to be seen as misunderstood but special, to be believed in despite flaws. The empath's gaze can feel like redemption. It says, I see your greatness. And for someone whose internal world is riddled with shame and self-doubt, That reflection becomes part of their identity structure. So when the empath leaves, it is not just abandonment. It is the loss of the one person who held a vision of them that they desperately wanted to believe. That creates a deep ego wound. Now, ego injury does not look like sadness on the surface. It often looks like anger, dismissal, coldness, or sudden indifference. It may look like, I never cared anyway. But internally, something destabilizing is happening. If the person who believed in me most deeply has walked away, what does that say about me? If the person who tolerated my flaws finally reached their limit, what does that reveal? If I am not reflected as special, who am I? These questions threaten the entire identity structure. And this is where the identity crisis begins. For much of their life, the narcissistic adaptation may have revolved around being exceptional, the smartest in the room, the most attractive, the most misunderstood, the most accomplished, even the most victimized. There is often a narrative of uniqueness. The empath reinforced that narrative. They listened intently. They admired strengths. They reassured during insecurity. They validated pain. In many ways, they helped stabilize the grandiose and vulnerable aspects of the identity. When they leave, the mirror shatters. Without that consistent affirmation, the narcissist may feel suddenly ordinary. And ordinariness to someone who equates it with invisibility or insignificance can feel intolerable. So the psyche reacts. It may inflate further, seeking louder admiration elsewhere. It may attempt to provoke jealousy in the empath. It may rapidly enter a new relationship to restore the sense of desirability. It may rewrite the story, devaluing the empath as weak, crazy, or unworthy. All of these reactions serve one purpose: protect the ego from collapse. Because beneath the surface reaction is something far more vulnerable: shame. Shame says, if they left, maybe I am not as powerful as I believed. Maybe I am not enough. That is the identity crisis. The narcissistic identity was built to outrun that shame. It was constructed to avoid feeling small, unseen, or unworthy. But when someone who once idealized you withdraws their admiration, the old shame rises. And shame, when unprocessed, is unbearable. This is why ego injury can trigger such dramatic responses. It is not about the specific person as much as it is about what their departure represents. It represents a crack in the illusion of invulnerability. The empath did not just love them, they believed in them. Losing that belief feels like losing a piece of the self. But here is the paradox. The collapse of a false identity, painful as it is, creates space for a more authentic one. If the narcissist can tolerate the ego injury, if they can resist the urge to immediately restore grandiosity, they may begin to ask deeper questions. Who am I without admiration? Who am I without being idealized? Who am I when someone sees my flaws and chooses to leave? These questions are terrifying because they strip away performance. But they also open the door to authenticity. Authenticity does not require being exceptional. It requires being real. The problem with a grandiose identity is that it must constantly be maintained. It is exhausting. Every interaction becomes a stage. Every criticism becomes an attack. When the empath leaves, the stage lights flicker. The performance falters. And for a moment, there is the possibility of stepping off the stage entirely. But stepping off requires humility. Humility is not humiliation. It is the willingness to acknowledge imperfection without collapsing into self-hatred. It is the ability to say, I have been defensive because I am afraid. I have sought admiration because I doubt myself. I have controlled because I felt powerless. That level of honesty dismantles the old identity, but it also frees the person from maintaining it. Because the truth is this: an identity built on superiority is fragile. An identity built on authenticity is resilient. When the empath leaves, the narcissist stands at a crossroads. One path leads to doubling down, seeking new admiration, reinforcing the narrative of specialness, protecting the ego at all costs. The other path leads inward, toward examining the shame beneath the performance. The first path feels easier in the short term. The second path feels devastating at first. But the second path is the only one that leads to integration. An ego injury, if faced honestly, can become a gateway to self-awareness. It can expose the gap between the image and the inner reality. It can reveal how much of the identity was dependent on external validation. And once that dependency is seen clearly, something powerful happens. You begin to understand that no one else can hold your worth for you. Not an empath, not an audience, not a partner. Worth that depends on admiration will always be unstable. So when we ask what happens spiritually when a narcissist loses an empath, this is part of the answer. The identity they constructed begins to tremble. The specialness feels uncertain. The superiority feels less convincing. And beneath the tremor is an invitation. An invitation to rebuild identity not around being admired, but around being accountable. Not around being exceptional, but around being present. Not around being invulnerable, but around being honest. Because in the end, the greatest threat to a false identity is not criticism. It is the loss of the person who believed in it the most.